here we are at the Jewish Community Action offices in St. Paul, right on the line with Minneapolis, more or less. And this evening, we are joined by Senator Zainab Mohammed of Senate District 63, Representative Frank Hornstein of House District 61A, and Dr. Brian Hughes of American University's Peril Research Labs, which I think lab is already in there, so I may have repeated myself like ATM machine. So tonight's event, which we have titled Combating Hate, a Diversity of Tactics, we will be talking with our three fantastic panelists about the wealth of resources that are available to not only prevent extremism, but for us to better be able to understand the media landscapes around us and how many different policies are out there to address these things in a non-carceral way. But first, I'd like to go and have each of our panelists just introduce themselves a little bit. And to start things off, I'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you into this kind of work, be it organizing, be it academia, whatever it may be. What brought you into this? So let's start with you, Senator.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you, everybody. It's good to be here. I'm Zainab Mohammed. I represent the Senate District 63, which is in South Minneapolis and a little bit of Southeast. And before I ran for office, I actually was an organizer, a community organizer. And I think 2016, when there was a mosque in Bloomington, Minnesota that was bombed, and that sort of made me think differently about hate crimes here in our state, and the fact that they can just sort of happen to a place of worship, which often is a space that's respected, that's sacred for people. And I wanted to be more involved in our community. I wanted to, create awareness, have people be sort of like connected in a space where all religions are protected, right? And so we know that if one is attacked, the other one is not far behind. And worked at CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations in Minnesota, and worked on hate crimes that were happening all over the state, whether in Moorhead, Minnesota, which is 4 hours away from the Twin Cities, and those have not gotten any less. And we know that also synagogues are getting attacked every single day, and hate crime is on the rise. And so when I ran for office, it was important to me to work on hate crimes, which was something that I helped work on when I was in the community, but as a legislator, it's a different experience, it's a different perspective. But that's sort of what brings me to this work. I'm a Muslim woman, I go to the mosque, I want to make sure my religion is protected and the religion of others is also protected as well.
Thank you, Senator.
Hi, well, good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here. Frank Hornstein, State Representative. The district I represent includes uptown and downtown Minneapolis and the surrounding neighborhoods. And I think I'm here, also similar to Senator Mohammed. I have a background in community organizing, and it's very nice for me to be back at the Jewish Community Action Office because I was one of the founders of this amazing organization 30 years ago, I guess, something like that, right? And so, but I think what really, I think brought me here and brought me to community organizing is my own personal family background. So my parents were Holocaust survivors. They both passed. And many of my relatives, I never knew my grandparents because they were killed. And so I think I just grew up knowing that what happens when extremism is allowed to flourish and fester and take over an entire society, that's very real, that has happened and continues to happen. And so I think it's really my family experience and the experience of being a community organizer that's brought me here.
Thank you. Dr. Hughes?
Well, first, let me just say how grateful I am to be here with you all. It's extremely flattering to share a couch with Representative Hornstein and Senator Mohammed. And maybe I can tell people a little bit about the lab. PERIL, or the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, is a applied research lab in the School of Public Affairs at American University. And we try to apply public health principles to the issue of radicalization to extremism, supremacist ideologies, conspiracy theory culture, and so on. The idea is that we want to find non-carceral preventative approaches to try to reduce the conditions that give rise to hate in the first place. I come to this work in kind of a roundabout way. Like a lot of millennials, I found myself extremely unemployed around 2010. And like a lot of millennials, I didn't really have anything to do except spend a lot of time online and look around and just see what strange things I could find. And as a result of that, I became very aware of the growing cultures of the online far right. So when, like a lot of millennials, I decided to go back to school and study media and communication, I thought I would do it with a focus on trying to address what I saw as a rising tide of hate online. And then we saw that migrate from online to offline very clearly. The events of Charlottesville are often kind of thought of as a very big event, but there were others before that too.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. And yeah, I can relate to that so much. Though I'm in the firmly mid-millennial section, and I was just going to college in 2008. I've certainly experienced that realm of the internet, and especially, gosh, we're at 2024. We're a decade out from what is known as Gamergate. If you don't know about Gamergate, please look it up. It really, understanding what happened 10 years ago really helps us understand a lot of the extremism that we're seeing now today. With that, I saw family, friends, and people who were as close to me as family become radicalized, which kind of brought me into this work. Similarly, in a roundabout way, I never went to school for this. I went to school just to be a history major. So it's wonderful to be around other people who are in this work, doing this work, because we see how this can impact those around us. So with that, I'd love to go and ask a little bit about what work you've been doing recently, and by recently, the last 4 or 5 years around these topics. I know our two legislators here have worked on bills together, but have also worked on other bills over the course of their careers. And of course, Dr. Hughes, you've been working with the lab, and I think folks would love to hear more about some of the resources from there. So I'll start with you, Dr. Hughes.
Okay. Well, I think we take a variety of approaches. The fact is, this kind of very upstream prevention work is relatively new. There aren't very many people working on it. So there's a lot of area to explore, and there's a lot of work that needs being done. But we've had some of our greatest successes working very closely with communities. There's a lot that you can do in big messaging campaigns and things like that, but some of the most effective and profound work happens at the community level. So we have done work with evangelical communities in Tarrant County, Texas, to try to shore up their resilience against some of the issues that the pastors in those communities were seeing creep in. We've just completed a 2-year-long project that was dedicated to resourcing community organizations and small nonprofits with tools and trainings to develop constructive dialogue and then also better messaging against hate and supremacist ideology. And we're also finishing a pilot program of what we call our care centers. These are regional networks of practitioners and community leaders. And the idea is that we want to build networks of practice, communities of practice, where people have the skills, the know-how, the capacity, and the confidence to intervene in the lives of young people if they're concerned that they're at risk for radicalization. That's sort of a 10,000-foot view. Happy to go into whatever detail you'd like later.
Thank you. Would either of you like to jump onto that next?
Well, sure, unless you want to.
No.
Okay. I'm glad Dr. Hughes had mentioned Charlottesville. That was a catalyzing event for so many people. And what we did that juncture was bring together a group of people to talk about, well, how do we deal with this issue? How do we prevent it? What do we need to do to address the issue of hate crimes? And there was a very expansive table, a lot of, we had people representing the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the LGBTQ IA plus community. We had Native folks, we had immigrants, just anyone who really was affected by this issue. And the consensus around the table was we need better community reporting, that our people don't feel comfortable necessarily going to the police when there's a hate crime. And so we kind of rolled up our sleeves and went to work and finally got a bill, Senator Mohammed's bill passed a couple of years ago that really does empower communities and community organizations to, collect this data and to be responsive. And I, looking forward to, the results of that, because I know that people do feel more comfortable, talking to, for example, an AAPI group who is very familiar with what's going on and very familiar with the community, will be much more responsive and supportive in this kind of situation.
Thank you, Frank. And Senator Mohammed, I mean, at this point in time, when Frank is talking about setting up that coalition, you were an organizer, and you and I organized together on, I suppose, the outside of the legislature, and then you ran for office and were elected. What were some of the most illuminating or profound differences you saw outside versus inside, and what do you think would be most helpful for people to know about how to best talk to their representatives about these issues?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think Representative Hornstein doesn't get enough credit for this, but I think I learned from him what it means to work in the legislature and get work done while also making sure that community is a priority and they have a voice in that process, and it's their bill and it's their language and it's how they want policies to get done, because he's done that before I was in office. And so it was really profound to walk in and say, maybe I can do that as well and be able to do it in a similar way. And I think often as legislators, we kind of think we know the best and we know what we're doing, but there are different ways, and people who do this work, who experience these issues, know much better. And so working on the bill the last year, that final year when we passed it was probably one of the easiest things to get done, because there was already a coalition, a process, a bill that was fully done, and all we needed to do was just get it through committees and get it passed. And looking forward to what those numbers are going to look like and how we can prevent more of that. But I think Representative Ornstein's work, I think, set it up for me to be really successful in that process. So often I like to credit him and Senator Last, because he gave me the bill when I walked in as well, and he carried it for a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think Senator Mohammed deserves a lot of credit too. She sort of says, well, we had a committee hearing, we went to the floor, it's this, that. It's not easy to do. And especially when you walk in there new, it was really a Herculean task to do this and to accomplish this in your first term. So all the things she was describing are very intense, and the community showing up at every juncture, I think, made a difference. We had op-eds, engaging the governor, all of these things this coalition did to ensure success. But really, Senator Mohammed's work was incredible, because it's not easy to pass a bill, even in a trifecta situation. So thank you.
Thank you both. And teamwork really does make the dream work.
Yeah.
So next, I'd like to move into talking a little bit about what the, I suppose, hate ecosystem looks like out there. And by that, I mean, is it as scary as people say, right? We see a lot of things on television saying big, scary things all the time. And I know that at least when I'm working with folks in the community, the first thing they're thinking of is, am I directly under attack, or what? And if not, what should I be worried about? What should I know more about? And Dr. Hughes, I'd love to start with you. Since you started us off with that 10,000-foot view of resources, what are some of those types of resources that can help people get that idea of what's going on and what might not be going on?
Yeah, well, I think that one of an important thing for the public to understand is that that landscape of hate is pretty fast moving. There are trends in extremist movements that can really go quite quickly. I mean, we're talking about 6-month, 12-month, 18-month cycles, depending on who's up or who's down. Now, there are some movements that tend to have longer life cycles and some that are sort of perennial. Anti-immigrant hate is very salient right now, but there's really a strong undercurrent of that, usually pretty constantly. Anti-Semitism is another constant, Islamophobia too. The one, though, that I have to say we're seeing the most concern about from parents, educators especially, is misogyny. There is really a wave of misogyny that seems to be growing out of a lot of the online cultures that have been thriving for the past few years. A lot of the young boys who grew up watching content like this online are now in high school or moving into college. And as they mature in age, this is really becoming a very serious problem. Now, my lab, Peril, we make an effort to address these trends when we can, but we also don't want to chase the trends. We want to provide resources that are perennial and that people can apply no matter what the pressing issue of the day is. Because the fact is the risk factors, the things that lead a person towards a hateful ideology are pretty consistent, irrespective of the ideology they ultimately end up adopting. So we have resources on our website. If you go to perilresearch.com, they're all free. We try to provide as close to all of our data as possible. We want to show that these aren't just good ideas and well-designed brochures. These are things that scientifically work. You can download things like our guide for parents and caregivers. Our guide for parents and caregivers lists the risk factors and the warning signs of radicalization. And then it also gives concrete steps for intervening. If a person works in a place of worship, we have our Peacemakers kit, which is available too. There's a variety. If you go on there, there's actually different buttons depending on who you are. If you're a parent or if you're an educator or a coach or a social worker, you can click the button and it'll bring up the resources that are going to be the most valuable to you.
Great. Yeah. And I can confirm it is a robust and simultaneously relatively easy to navigate website. There's a lot of websites these days that are kind of difficult to navigate, and it is refreshing.
I appreciate
that. I forgot what that next question was. Senator Mohammed, over the last few, gosh, I think it's you mentioned both you and Representative Hornstein mentioned the attempted firebombing of Dara Farouk in Bloomington, and that was a big moment for finding some kind of glaring loopholes in state law. But in the last, and thankfully those have now been closed, and thanks to your work in the legislature. But we've also been seeing more targeted attacks on Islamic centers in Minnesota. I believe CARE recently said in a press release that roughly about 33 different attacks have happened in the last couple of years, which numerically means that Minnesota is leading the nation in that, and we're also a relatively small state. But many folks are still unsure how to report or uncomfortable reporting. As legislators, what do you find to be the most helpful when working with constituents who have experienced a hate crime, hate incident, something that might fall into the civil category realm, when they're trying to navigate the system and end up contacting your offices?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, I think one of the first things the thing I've come across the most often has been people who have gone through a hate crime, right? Like somebody, for instance, somebody called my office a couple of weeks ago. She said I was taking a walk during lunch break on University Avenue, Minneapolis. Not on this side, but and this guy turns around his car and he's driving towards me to the sidewalk. And she said, then I get confused, so I start walking faster, but he's driving towards me fast, so I start running, right? And she's like, I assume it's like because I'm wearing a hijab and I'm visibly walking around as a Muslim woman, but I don't really want to assume. So like, I didn't call the cops. Should I just assume it's an incident? And the thing is, if you can't, you know, like in that moment, you're not gonna really be like, it's a hate crime, right? Like you're gonna naturally be scared, run. But when you do have the time, it's important that you make that call. And so talk to the organizations in your community, talk to the mosque leaders, the synagogue leaders in your community, and have those conversations. Let them sort of help you process it and do the appropriate reporting that they need. But I think for me, I often deal with people who don't know or who are afraid of reporting or who are like, what if I'm wrong later? How do I know? And so it's important that we affirm those people that what you're dealing with is a hate crime and that we need to be able to report it. And Beth likes to say, if we can't see it, then we'll never be able to report it, right? Something like that you said before. She said something that was like pretty profound. That was, if we don't know what the numbers are, we'll never be able to do anything about it. And so we need to know.
Thank you. And Representative Hornstein, you've been in office for what, 22 years now?
Yeah.
And you've been involved in community action for so long. A lot of people might not know this. I'm going to kvel about Frank a little bit now, but Frank wrote a wonderful master's thesis back in the 80s about traditions of Jewish organizing. And I was in the Jewish Historical Society's archives and got to read through letters from Paul Wellstone when he was still a professor at Carleton, citing your thesis as inspiration for some ideas for how to go and deal with, at that time, attempted neo-Nazi and neo-Nazi adjacent radicalization that was happening during the farm crisis. So I know you've been in this work for a long time. What have you seen and experienced? What have you seen work? What have you seen maybe not work?
Well, I think the example you raised is a good one. And what I was, struck by in studying the farm crisis in the 1980s is that you had these very extreme right-wing groups going through rural Minnesota and other parts of the Midwest, blaming the farm crisis on a Jewish banking conspiracy or some kind of, whatever they did, it was the Jews were to blame for this economic situation, which was very reminiscent of some of the Nazi rhetoric, right? And what I found that was a good way to address this issue, as a progressive, was to connect the Jewish community to the progressive farm organizations that were really talking about economic justice for farmers. And so I think that allyship is so critical. And I think what was really heartwarming, and one of the first times I'd seen it, it was the great work that CARE did and the Dara, Farouk, and other groups did, is that you had a community of allies coming together. And I felt the same thing when we had a memorial service for the 11 Jewish worshipers that were killed in Pittsburgh. Just people from all faiths coming together, all walks of life to support us. And I think that this kind of coalition building, these relationships that we've been able to build together are really the antidote to hate. Coming together as a community is the best strategy. And building these types of coalitions, as happened in the 1980s in the farm crisis.
Thank you, Frank. And Brian, now I want to, or Dr. Hughes, now I want to kind of bounce this to you, since you are part of a national group, at least compared to us, where, we're just Minnesota. Some people consider us flyover territory. We're not. We're wonderful. But you also, in your lab, have folks who have done international work, folks who have done work in Germany. And is there anything that your organization looks to from either other parts of the country or even abroad that offers insight into how we can address things here at home.
Absolutely. First of all, I love Minnesota. I love the Upper Midwest for all kinds of reasons. But the energy that I see here in terms of the community work that's happening is just truly an inspiration. And I'm not just saying that it is one of the inspirations that we take with us in our lab when we try to think about how to address these problems. The organizing energy that's shown to be possible here is really what we would like to see in communities all over the country. I mentioned our care centers. We're wrapping up some pilot programs right now in Georgia and in Michigan, and we've seen what can be set up in just a year or two there, and we'd really like to see that spread.
Now, can you go into a little more detail about the care centers?
Sure. The Care Center pilot program, it was a proof of concept. It was based on the German model. So it was taking inspiration from a foreign country. After reunification, Germany had serious problems with neo-Nazi violence and organizing. And so they began to create in-community centers called mobile advisory units. And the idea was that these would be shops where people could come for assistance. If they had a relative or a friend or someone they cared about who was radicalizing, they could go there and they could get advice on what to do. If they were the victim of a hate crime, they could go there, they could get advice on what to do. If they themselves were a member of an extremist scene or movement and wanted to distance themselves, they could go to a mobile advisory unit and be given the resources that they needed. So really the idea was that they put an awful lot of energy and money into staffing and training these mobile advisory units. And we wanted to see if that could be done here in the United States. Because, as I said earlier, prevention is really a model that hasn't been tried very much here in this country. Now, it's not to say that it's a cure-all. We can see in Germany right now, they are having some pretty significant issues with the extreme right. But it does seem to make a significant difference in the areas where it's the most robust. So we'd like to take inspiration and take that as our model and then see if we can adapt it to the American context, which has its own needs and its own assets too. There are some really unique things about the United States that could help to support that kind of a program that don't necessarily exist elsewhere.
Thank you. I interrupted you earlier for details about the care centers. Is there anything else?
Well, that was where I was going.
Great,
actually.
wonderful, wonderful.
Great minds think alike. No, I was going to the international. I will also just say shout out to New Zealand. New Zealand is really taking these issues seriously after the Christchurch attacks. They did what, frankly, every country ought to be doing after a Christchurch or a Charlottesville. And the energy and the resources and the care that they put into prevention work is really inspiring. And I think we should look to them as an example.
Wonderful. That's good to know. I'm hoping that lots of folks will be Googling things after this or during. So, shoot. All right, we've asked about the care centers. We've asked about the organizing backgrounds. How are we doing on time?
Impressive that you have all these questions
memorized. I really was going for it. I was very confident I'd have them all up there.
You're doing great.
Thank you. So don't know. Is there anything that y'all would like to kind of highlight that you've learned over the course of this? I think one thing that's
Any from Zoom?
Oh, we do not have any Zoom questions at this time, but for our wonderful Zoom participants, there is the Q&A function available, and please utilize it because your friendly neighborhood combating hate organizer is starting to run low on questions because our panelists are giving such wonderful, succinct answers.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Because something that that we, as a research lab in a university, we always want to get better data. And just one of the biggest gaps is in hate crime reporting. And it sounds like this is something that has really been a focus. So I would love to hear more about what you all think we could be doing better when it comes to hate crime reporting. And if there's any way that academia or the nonprofit world can help to support that.
Well, I think, again, the legislation was one thing, but our consultations with the community indicated, number one, exactly what you said, that and the data bears that out, that something like only 1/3 of the actual hate crimes are reported. Mm-hmm. So we can't begin to address the issue if we don't know the extent of the issue or who's being impacted by it. And so that's why this group that came together post Charlottesville really zeroed in on reporting and then zeroed in on why this was the case. And two things emerged from that. Number one, the training manual that law enforcement uses to address hate crimes was from 1990. So it hadn't been updated, and so much of Minnesota's demography has changed, and so much of what we're experiencing has changed. So we wanted to have better community reporting, and we wanted to make sure that law enforcement had the tools it needed to respond much more effectively to communities who are impacted by this issue.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I often wrestle with is, when a synagogue gets attacked, we know exactly what's happening and why, right? It's easy we've learned as a society to be able to point that out as a hate crime. But as we're sort of going into this world of technology and most people are on the internet, there is insane amount of hate crime happening online. And so how do we address that? What does that look like? How do you even report that, right? Can you report that? Because often it can just go somebody saying really horrific things to you, to somebody just sending you a picture of your address, and then now it's like you don't know who this person is and what that is, what's going to happen to you. And so I'd be curious to know, have you, not to throw a question back to you, but sort of how do we combat that?
I think that is a really hard question to answer. The term that gets used, at least in DC, is lawful but awful activity. So that's things like harassment online, stuff that doesn't rise to the level of a crime that can be prosecuted or reported, or but still we know again from the science that these problems have measurable impacts on the people and the communities who suffer from them. There are mental health impacts. Mental health is reflective on physical health. So things like stress and depression are associated with things like heart disease or accidents. And also associated with very clear economic problems, educational problems. People who suffer identity-based harassment also experience more problems at school associated with concentration and mental health and feelings of safety and security that you need in order to learn and in order to thrive in an educational environment. So I think that unfortunately, this isn't a good prescription for the question that you asked. But as a general principle, this is a whole of society problem. It's not just a law enforcement problem. It's a cardiology problem. It's an elementary and primary education problem as well. And so if we have a whole of society problem, we need whole of society solutions. Again, coming from DC, I tend to know a little bit more about the federal side of things than the state side of things. But the fact that so much of our funding to address these issues comes from Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security, I think we could be thinking a lot more broadly. The Department of Health and Human Services could be funding or pursuing their own really great programming to try to intervene in issues like this. The Department of Education, certainly. And we've seen some motion toward that in a way that I think is really positive. The Biden administration has made some very strong statements and set some mandates asking these departments to begin work laying the foundation for that kind of approach. So I'm optimistic that we can do that, but we have to keep pushing and we have to keep advocating for that and reminding people that the problem goes even deeper than the most heinous events that we see on the television.
Before I ask this question, I have one thing to add to that question that you asked us, because as Representative Hornstein said, for a long time, the FBI and many other law enforcement agencies and societies have said that roughly about 1/3 of hate crimes are reported, roughly 2/3 are not. And that's just the things that face a criminal component, right? It does not include things that are civil violations that could be employment discrimination, that is actually a violation of the law, as much as it's often forgotten that, wage theft is a violation of the law. It is, it's just not penalized the same. But one thing that we see a lot and that we've seen happen in the last few years of FBI reports is a stark reminder that that most of this reporting is still voluntary from local police departments. We'll end up seeing large gaps of the country with just a goose egg, 0 hate crimes. It can't happen here. And we know that things are happening there. And sometimes it's a matter of law enforcement training. It's good to train. But other times it's a matter of, if I recall correctly, there was a zero form. There's a form that could be submitted to say that nothing happened. And that's easier to fill out than the other ones. And it really only has it there for hate and bias crimes. It's not there for grand larceny. And maybe just a simple thing like eliminating zero reports as an option could help us close those gaps. Or tying that to, if you, non-submission of these things means you don't get federal dollars for said law enforcement agency. If you want to play the game, you have to go and, turn in the paperwork. That's my 2 cents. I'm not a legislator, but that, when I'm looking at how could that help, legislative bodies always play the carrot and the stick with money, and maybe that can help with reporting gaps. And would love to hear y'all's thoughts as I continue to formulate how to ask this question in a C3 friendly way.
Well, non-reporting begets more non-reporting. The people in our communities aren't dumb. They know what's going on. They know that if their police aren't reporting any hate crimes, and they see hate crimes happening or hear about them, they're not going to report the ones that they experience. So there's a spiral of silence that needs to be broken. And I love your suggestion. I think that's a very simple approach to it.
Well, we have, generally speaking, I think there has been a shift in the way law enforcement views these things. But again, there was some pushback in terms of our requirements for the post board, right? That's the board that credits officers. We wanted to have, everyone come for a training, a large training, and well, in some of the smaller departments, they can't give up a day, this type of thing. But I think this does have to be part of the training as any other function would be in terms of law enforcement training. So we're working with the post board. It's a process, to put this on the radar. I don't think anyone's denying it's an issue, but I think it does have to be prioritized.
All right, I think I formulated this. So one of our wonderful attendees here wanted to know what our panelists think about how we can address hate and extremism as it's becoming a bigger part of even civic society, with politicians, judges, etc., attending or endorsing events from well-known far-right or extremist hate groups, such as the Proud Boys, Vanguard America, or whatever goofy name they have now. For those who don't know, many of these groups sometimes change their names, as Brian kind of alluded to, every 12 to 18 months. So can you tell us, how do you contend with that, especially our legislators? That's something you might have to run into among colleagues. I'm not saying that's any of your colleagues at this moment in time, but how do you how do you deal with that coming into a legislative body? And then when it comes to Dr. Hughes, how do you go and deal with that as a organization that is working with various different authorities from different levels of government?
Well, while also staying on the lines of C3, but, I do think for sure some of our colleagues do walk a fine line on this issue, and in terms of not just being endorsing them, but spewing rhetoric and sort of hateful words that they use, both in the legislature and online. And often they can create a space where a lot of people who do follow them, who are part of those crowds, do come after legislators of color, legislators who have different ideologies and beliefs than them. And I think the only way we can combat that is exactly what Frank said. It's coming together and making sure that they understand that our collective community is not going to tolerate that, and our support for each other is going to be much stronger than their hateful words. And so naming when it happens, but also making sure that there's support on the ground and in the community and that we're fully aligned is really important. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. And, you would be amazed and shocked and saddened, I think, by the amount of the way marginalized groups and even individual legislators are marginalized in the legislature, whether it be BIPOC or Muslim or Jewish or trans, LGBTQ. I see it in my experience. Oftentimes, I can't even count. There's at least 3 or 4 times per legislative session, someone gets up on the House floor in committee and makes very inappropriate Holocaust analogies or comparisons. This happened in the campaign trail just a few weeks ago with one of the candidates. Your question, how do you deal with it? I think it's important to call it out when it happens. Otherwise, it'll continue to happen. One can do it privately, or in a more sitting down with someone in dialogue, or depending on how they react. Sometimes you have to make a big public. Make sure that the media and others are informed and can report on this, so it doesn't happen again, and that the people that are making these kinds of statements are held accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in order to accomplish all that, it's necessary not to allow this kind of behavior to become normalized. And when it's coming from figures of significant power and influence, there's always a risk that it can be. So the way that we think about what constitutes extremism and hate shouldn't just track to what's popular. Extremism isn't just what's fringe. There's a very influential scholar whose work we draw on a lot in our lab. His name is J.M. Berger. I recommend anyone watching this look him up. His definition of extremism is very valuable because it really pins things in a more concrete way. Just that extremism is any outlook that separates the world into an in-group and an out-group, and says these groups have irreconcilable differences based on identity, not based on behavior. And that those irreconcilable differences ultimately can only be solved through separation, domination, or extermination. They can't be negotiated. There can't be a coexistence. And when you use that framework, you're able to pin this to something that's a little more permanent than the winds of who's in power or who isn't. It's also another concept that Berger is developing now that is very much, I think, in need, is what he calls lawful extremism, which is what happens when that definition of extremism is held by people with a great deal of power and influence, and then what happens when it's enshrined into law, as it was with, say, the Jim Crow South. The mere fact that something is legal doesn't mean that it's not, doesn't validate it.
Now I'm thinking about one of my favorite Howard Zinn essays. I believe it's called The Tyranny of the Law. It's a 1971, after his time working with his students who were involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Because thank you for specifically naming the Jim Crow South. A lot of times when folks talk about extremism being constituted into law, it's really easy to jump to Germany in the 1930s, but we have plenty of examples right here in the United States, throughout the US. Our laboratories of democracy, all of our different states and localities, they're not always laboratories for the best and brightest things. Sometimes they have been laboratories for some truly reprehensible methods of law. So we have another question that I've been handed from our audience here at the office. This comes from someone who works at a local university and supports initiatives on campus constructive dialogue and multi-faith relationship building. And safe to say it's been a very contentious year on campuses with both the upcoming election and everything involving the current war and crisis in Gaza and the continuing to spin out a situation in the Middle East. Do any of you have recommendations about what universities should be doing to combat hate? Are there examples of universities that you have found to be really impressive of how to go and bring down the temperature between students and administrations and be able to have a more constructive space rather than a place where it's an us against them, and oftentimes it ends up being administrations versus the student bodies?
Well, I think that the universities that were able to avoid the worst of what was happening in the spring were the ones that already had good programming in place to bring people together across differences. You can't begin dialogue the moment a crisis strikes. Then it's not really dialogue. It's almost always an argument, and it's just a question of how polite or impolite the argument is going to be. Dialogue is really a process. It's not an event. It needs to be built on a foundation of mutual trust and mutual support across difference. So this is a groundwork that needs to be laid years in advance. And it was those universities that were laying that groundwork years in advance that were connecting their student groups, their student faith and identity groups, and fostering programming long before anything that happened in 2003. Those were the ones that were able to weather the storm, and those are still the ones that are doing the best from my observation.
I mean, I think a good example of that on the ground here is the work. I know I'm in the Jewish Community Action Office, but Jewish Community Action had developed relationships with a lot of different Muslim organizations for years before this current crisis happened. And I think the fact that those relationships have survived and strengthened and even deepened through this, very, very difficult and traumatic time, speaks to what you were saying. We need to work on these relationships, well ahead of time. And now is the time to grow them, because, we're going to be in a challenging situation in this country for years to come. I mean, the amount of Islamophobic incidents is just skyrocketed. The amount of anti-Semitic incidents has skyrocketed. Violence against, trans women of color also. And so if we're going to be able to, again, just going back to what I said before, it's all about relationships and being in community with one another. And so I applaud JCA and CARE and reviving sisterhood, for staying, in contact during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think they've done a really good job of answering the question. I think the role of the university is to make sure that student groups are connected and that they have a deep relationship. I think what Frank said is right. I think we're in a difficult and trying times, but I think as long as people understand that there's not really much that we as individuals can do, but as long as there's collective support and love for one another and understanding that, what is happening is affecting so many people across the world, and that we don't take that sort of like emotion of what we're feeling out on each other, but support and show up and speak up against hate where it's happening. It's really important that we do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that question made me think of a panel that was at a conference that Dr. Hughes and I were at just this week, specifically on combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I believe one of the panelists said, you can't punish your way to pluralism. And I thought that was such a fantastic way to go and summarize these things, right? Like that old adage of the beatings will continue until morale improves. That's not going to be a way for us as a society to be able to go and move forward on anything. And when it comes to college campuses, I found that to be such a succinct way to go and put things. When schools respond with an iron fist, of course students stand up and continue to push back, regardless of what they believe in. We've seen it throughout time in this country. But when schools are investing in these programs long-term and really dedicating themselves to ensuring that students get to know each other, that makes a world of difference.
I think it's important to remember that it feels good to connect across difference. It feels good to be in community with people from a different background than yourself. So all the more reason to start this work as a good in and of itself, rather than a response to some exogenous factor. This is a way to enrich our lives too. This isn't just responding to something bad. This is a good thing in and of itself.
And I think it's also important to sort of understand our responsibility and the roles that we play as individuals, as lawmakers, as just regular community members, as university faculty. And, our role is to, me as a Muslim woman, it's like I have a deep amount of sadness, right, of what's happening, but I also understand that my Jewish community members are feeling just as sad. So it's like, how do we come together and have empathy for one another and not sort of, because I think what's happening is we sort of get in our own worlds and then we shut down and we don't talk to other people. But the more you talk to people, you sort of understand where they're coming from. You see the world a little differently. You understand what the people are going through and you feel less alone. You're like, oh, it's not just me. You're feeling it as well. And so I think I'd encourage for people to just talk to each other, have conversations.
Yeah, Senator Mohammed and I checked in with each other shortly after all of this happened. I remember I was sitting by B'nai Makaska and we were on the phone, and it was just comforting that we were just talking, and feeling each other's pain. And, that just went a long way for me, and knowing that things would, at least locally, that we could work together, just meant the world. And I had those kinds of experiences with other other Muslim colleagues in the House as well. We were friends and we remain friends through all this.
And we had coffee on Christmas Day.
Yes, yes. Because where else can a Jew and a Muslim go?
Of course.
Exactly.
The Somali coffee shop was open.
Exactly.
Let me see if, all right, I see we've got one hand raised, and all right, I'm gonna try this out. This will be the first time we've got somebody asking, oh wait, I've got a Q&A thing. We have somebody who's very excited because you are their senator, Senator Mohammed. And then I see Diane's hand is raised. Diane, please unmute yourself. I think we'll be able to hear you. And yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. This has been very informative. And I would like, really am curious and would like more information on the care centers and the mobile advisory units. So if Brandon, if you can just, if you are accessible, I'd love to at least download your materials and get that website and so forth. That would be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. If you go to our website, it's perilresearch.com. You can find information about all of our programs, including the care programs. If you want to, I don't want to announce it on a broadcast, but if you want to type it in the chat, maybe Brandon, you can give my email.
Happy to do it.
Reach out to me. As I said, we're wrapping up our pilot programs in Georgia and in Michigan. But we intend to continue both of them, as well as expand into other states. Minnesota is one of the states where we are the furthest along in that expansion work. Really, the Upper Midwest has been the most receptive to this whole idea. So we're looking to move from Michigan to Minnesota and some other places too. You know, look for more news in 2025 and 2026.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say I agree 100% with you have to talk to one another. I try my best to talk across the United States at every opportunity I get, every Zoom I can possibly, and meet people and talk to them. We agree, and sometimes we disagree, but we don't sign off. We don't walk away. You know, we will continue to talk. It was interesting that you talked about the word and how to market and what do you do. I was in a Zoom last night or the night before. I no longer keep track. Yeah. And one of the guests recommended a book, which I bought immediately, called The Words That Work by Luntz, Luntz. And I am into that now, reading that in terms of trying to understand and get deeper. What I am curious about, and it happens most in just about every Zoom I've ever been in, is the constant not remembering the history of America. It's not that the extremists are new. It's not new. The acts are not new. They have been here since 1400 when they first came here. What happened with the Native Americans, the South Americans, and so forth. It's not new, the violence, and the hate is not new either. What's interesting is how did anybody and everybody learn this not knowing and not speaking to anybody? I mean, how can you hate somebody that you know nothing about, or a culture you know nothing about? Where does that come from? And you mentioned, you know, it's happening as early as primary school, elementary schools or middle schools, well then, where does that 5-year-old get that information? Where? Then are they online with that already? I mean, where does that come from? So, I mean, the reality for that and the denial of how we learn, we're not born racist. We're not born anti-Semitic. So where's that information come from in 5 years? From the crib to there?
That's a great question. And I'm not trying to promote our materials too much, but if you look at our Parents and Caregivers Guide,
that's what we brought you here
there's
for,
some
Brian.
great information.
Thank you. That's exactly what I want to hear.
So there are some very common social and emotional factors that can lead a person to be vulnerable to hate, for lack of a better word. When people feel as if their life is out of their control, they can go looking around for excuses, things to blame. It's called compensatory control. So you need to compensate for feeling a lack of control. Childhood trauma. Childhood trauma doesn't cause people to be extremists, but extremists typically have very high rates of childhood trauma. So there's something there, some problem that they're trying to solve through engagement with hate. And the interesting thing is these risk factors, and more that you can read about in the guide, these are risk factors that are common to a lot of negative social patterns. So the same risk factors that you might see in a person who becomes a violent extremist are also risk factors that you see for people who get involved in gang activity or drug and alcohol abuse or abusive interpersonal relationships. The thing that's different is whether the person who has this sort of demand meets the supply that they need. So a person who has these vulnerabilities, it's a question: do they meet a social worker who can help them navigate and heal from this? Or do they meet a street gang that gives them a place of belonging and a sense of power? Or are they online where there are, let's say, neo-Nazi recruiters who are there with propaganda and easy answers and suggestions of who to hate? And, a long time ago, it was maybe less likely that a young person was going to encounter that kind of propaganda. Nowadays, as you pointed out, with the availability of online media, it's much, much more likely. It's practically inevitable, if you spend any length of time online, that you're going to encounter some kind of propaganda telling you who you ought to hate. So one of the reasons why we're seeing it at younger and younger ages, we think, is because of that dynamic.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. And we're approaching the end of our evening. Before I kind of toss it to each of you to kind of give closing remarks of what you'd love people to go and take away from this conversation, what you've personally learned the most about, or what you're actually curious about learning more about. One of the things I really love that you said, Senator, was that legislators don't know everything. None of us know everything, and there's beauty in knowing that none of us know everything. It means that everything we learn is every moment we have is an opportunity to learn. We're all standing on the shoulders of each other's giants. Well, I already teed it up right there. So let's go and toss it to you, Senator.
Yeah, I think I would like to learn more about sort of the work you do. So I'll be doing a little bit of digging into that and seeing how we can shape it in the world of technology, and what that could look like. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be in this space. I'm grateful for all the work you guys do. You have no idea how much work you carry onto the community. And I think community organizations, especially nonprofit organizations, people don't realize the work that they carry and how much trauma that comes with, and that these folks go home with that trauma and come back and start over the next day and help others. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And of course, thank you, Representative Hornstein, for your years of service and for also taking on, taking young legislators like myself under your wing and being a support system for us. So thank you.
Well, thank you. You've been a mentor to me. So, and all of your insights and observations and action over the years that you've taken on, not just the hate crimes, but so many big, difficult issues. It's really going to be incredible just to see your career grow and flourish as it already has. I would also echo Senator Mohammed's interest in the care centers, and Diane, the caller's interest. Anything that we can do that's innovative and that's new to prevent hate crimes before they happen, to bring communities together. The proactive work that was done, again, by JCA and all of those groups in the coalition is inspiring, and it's a model. But how can we, take that to the next level? That's what I'm curious about. I don't know, I have a hunch, based on some of your work, but I did attend a White House meeting where I first came in contact with Peril, and was very just impressed with the work. And it was, I think it was called a Summit on Combating Violent Extremism. And again, the diversity of voices in that room were impressive. And if we can keep that coalition together and to grow it, I think good things will happen.
I agree, and thank you for that. I think that what I'm very interested to learn is the situation on the ground in all the different regions of this country, because no two communities are exactly the same, and the problems that they face and the skills that they bring to solutions are going to be different everywhere. And in the times that I've been able to get close to one community or another, that's been some of the most personally rewarding work that I've ever been privileged to do. So I think that finding a way to merge that very on the ground embodied community work with some of these principles is, I think it's the future. I genuinely do.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes, and thank you for wrapping us up right into what the title of this get together was, a diversity of tactics, right? Like, the only way we're going to get through to the other side is realizing that none of us have the one-size-fits-all solution, and that we have a wealth of knowledge out there already and a wealth of knowledge yet to be created together. So with one last thank you, I'd like to thank all three of you on behalf of not just Jewish Community Action, but also Reviving the Islamic Sisterhood, Council of American Islamic Relations Minnesota, and our other wonderful partners in the Communities Combating Hate Coalition. And to our friendly folks online, I hope you have a wonderful night. You will receive the recording later, along with all of the links. And to our people here, you'll be able to mingle, I suppose. So have a great evening, everybody.